It is the spring of 210 BCE, somewhere on the eastern coast of China. Dawn breaks over the harbor. Mist rolls off the water, and through that mist, you can see them. Ships. Dozens of ships. Some accounts say 60 vessels, others say 100. The exact number has been lost to time, but what we know is this: it was a fleet unlike anything that had sailed before. The harbor is crowded, not just with sailors and dock workers, but with families. Thousands of families saying goodbye. Because this isn't a military expedition. This isn't a merchant voyage. This is something stranger, something unprecedented in Chinese history. On those ships, 3,000 young people, men and women, teenagers to young adults, all described in the records as being of good birth. With them, craftsmen of every trade, blacksmiths who can work iron, carpenters who can build houses, weavers who can make cloth, farmers who know how to cultivate rice, and supplies, mountains of supplies, seeds of 5 different grains, rice, wheat, millet, beans, hemp, tools for farming, weapons for defense, provisions for months, perhaps years at sea. This isn't an expedition. This is a civilization packed into wooden ships, ready to sail into the unknown. At the prow of the lead vessel stands one man. His name is Xu Fu. He is a court alchemist, a scholar, a man who has convinced the most powerful emperor in the world to give him everything he asked for. He has promised to return with something impossible, the elixir of immortality. The sails are raised, the anchors are pulled. Slowly, the fleet begins to move. Families on the shore are weeping now, waving, watching their children disappear. Because at some level, everyone knows the truth. This is a one-way voyage. These 3,000 young people are never coming home. The fleet moves east, toward the rising sun, toward the open ocean. The ships grow smaller, fading into the mist and the morning light. And then they're gone. That fleet was never seen again. Not one ship returned. Not one sailor came back to tell what happened. Not one of those 3,000 young people ever set foot in China again. Xu Fu and his followers vanished completely from history. But that's not where the story ends. Because for the last 2,200 years, people across Asia have claimed they know what happened. Villages in Japan say Xu Fu landed on their shores. They point to shrines built in his honor, to graves that supposedly hold his bones. They celebrate festivals every year, reenacting his arrival, honoring the man they believe founded their communities. In Korea, there are similar claims. Traditions passed down through generations about Chinese settlers who arrived in ancient times, bringing new knowledge, new technologies, new blood. And then there are the stranger stories, the legends, the sightings, reports that Xu Fu didn't just settle somewhere and live out his life, reports that he found exactly what he was looking for, that he discovered the secret of immortality, that he's still alive, somewhere out there, having achieved what every emperor in history has failed to achieve, conquering death itself. This is the story we're chasing tonight, the story of the greatest disappearing act in Chinese history, the story of 3,000 people who sailed away and were never heard from again, and the story of one man, an alchemist, a con artist, a hero, or perhaps something stranger, who may have actually found what he was searching for. Before we begin this journey into one of Asia's oldest mysteries, I want to ask you something. If you believe that some questions are worth asking even when we may never find the answers, if you believe that the greatest mysteries of history deserve to be explored, then help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to keep diving into the enigmas of the past. Tonight, we will follow a ghost fleet across the ocean. We will examine evidence scattered across 3 countries in 2,200 years. We will hear what ancient historians recorded, what modern archaeologists have found, what genetic science tells us, and what local traditions claim. We will explore every theory about where Xu Fu went, from the plausible to the impossible. And at the end, we will confront a strange truth, that despite 2 millennia of investigation, despite countless theories and research, we still don't know what happened to Xu Fu. We don't know where he landed. We don't know if he succeeded or failed. We don't know how he died, or if he died at all. This is a story about a man who became a legend simply by sailing away and never coming back. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand Xu Fu's story, we first need to understand the man who sent him on that voyage. Because this isn't just a story about an alchemist. It's a story about power, paranoia, and the desperate human desire to escape death. The year is 221 BCE. For the first time in 500 years, China is united under a single ruler. His name is Ying Zheng, but history knows him by a different title, Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor. He is 38 years old, and he has accomplished something that seemed impossible. Through 20 years of brutal warfare, he has conquered all the rival kingdoms, ended the Warring States period, and unified China. He has created an empire. And now that he's created it, he's terrified of losing it. Not just losing his empire, losing his life. Let me paint you a picture of what the first emperor's life was like, so you understand why immortality became his obsession. The year is 227 BCE. Ying Zheng, not yet the emperor, still just the king of Qin, is holding court in his palace. A man named Jing Ke has arrived with gifts. He's an emissary from one of the rival kingdoms, come to negotiate peace, or so he claims. Jing Ke approaches the throne carrying a rolled map, supposedly showing territories his kingdom is willing to cede. He kneels before the king and begins to unroll the map on the floor. And as the map unrolls, something falls out, a dagger. Before anyone can react, Jing Ke grabs the dagger and lunges at the king. What happens next is almost comical, except for the fact that it nearly ended Chinese history before it began. The king runs. He runs around the throne room in circles, the assassin chasing him. The guards can't help. By law, no one except the king is allowed to carry weapons in the throne room, and the guards are too far away anyway. The king tries to draw his ceremonial sword to defend himself, but the sword is long, ornamental, meant for display. It keeps catching on his robes. He's running, stumbling, the assassin right behind him, and he cannot get his sword free. Finally, someone shouts from the side of the room, "Push it behind you!" The king pushes the sword scabbard behind his back, and suddenly the blade comes free. He spins, and in one desperate motion he cuts the assassin's leg, then his arm. The assassin falls. Guards rush in and kill him. The king survives. Barely. This was not the only assassination attempt. Historical records document at least 2 more. Each time Yingzheng, soon to be Qin Shi Huang, escaped by luck or chance or the incompetence of his would-be killers. But each attempt changed him, made him more paranoid, more isolated, more obsessed with control, and more terrified of death. After he unified China and became the first emperor, that fear consumed him. Because now he had everything, absolute power over millions of people, and death could take it away at any moment. So he became obsessed with 2 things. First, absolute control. He standardized everything across China: writing, currency, measurements, even the width of wagon axles, so that all carts would fit the same roads. He built an extensive network of roads and canals to connect his empire. He connected and extended walls in the north to create what would eventually become the Great Wall. And he ruled with absolute brutality. If you questioned his authority, you died. If you possessed books he hadn't approved, you died. In 213 BCE, he ordered the burning of books, thousands of texts destroyed. In 212 BCE, he buried 460 Confucian scholars alive for criticizing his policies. This is not legend. This is documented history. Second, immortality. Because control meant nothing if he was going to die. He needed to live forever. And so he turned to the Fangshi. In ancient China, there was a class of people called Fangshi, Fangshi. The term is usually translated as method masters or recipe gentlemen, but that doesn't quite capture what they were. Fangshi were a combination of many things: herbalists, chemists, astrologers, philosophers, shamans, and con artists. Some were legitimate early scientists, experimenting with minerals and plants to find medicinal properties. Others were charlatans who promised miracles they couldn't deliver, but they all shared one thing. They claimed to possess secret knowledge about how to extend life, restore youth, and ultimately achieve immortality. This wasn't a fringe belief. The pursuit of physical immortality was a major part of Chinese culture during this period. It was rooted in Taoist philosophy, which taught that through the right combination of meditation, diet, exercise, alchemy, and spiritual practice, a person could refine their body and spirit until they became a Xian, an immortal. The Xian were said to live in hidden paradises, often on mystical islands in the Eastern Sea, where they had transcended the normal limits of human life. They could fly, they didn't age, they had achieved perfect harmony with the universe, and many people genuinely believed this was possible. Qin Shi Huang employed dozens of Fangshi. They created elixirs for him, concoctions made from mercury, jade, cinnabar, gold, and various herbs. He drank these elixirs regularly, believing they would extend his life. The tragic irony, which we now know from modern analysis of his tomb, is that these elixirs were almost certainly poisoning him. Mercury was a primary ingredient in many immortality elixirs, and mercury poisoning causes exactly the kind of slow decline that the first emperor experienced in his later years. He was literally dying from drinking immortality potions, but he didn't know that. He just knew he was aging, and he was desperate for something that worked. And then, in 219 BCE, a man came to court with a different story. The historical records tell us very little about who Zhu Fu was before he entered the emperor's service. We know he was from Qi, one of the eastern coastal states that Qin Shi Huang had conquered during his unification wars. Qi was on the coast of what is now Shandong province, facing the Yellow Sea. It was a place of sailors, fishermen, and merchants who traded with Korea and other lands across the water. We know Xu Fu practiced the arts of the Fangxi. He knew herbs, alchemy, divination, the things these method masters were expected to know. And we know that in 219 BCE, he approached the first emperor with a proposition unlike any the emperor had heard before. Imagine the scene. The throne room at the palace. The first emperor, now in his 40s, sitting on his throne, surrounded by guards, ministers, and other Fangxi. He has heard 1,000 promises of immortality. He has tried 100 different elixirs. None of them have worked. And into this room walks Xu Fu. The historical texts don't record his exact words, but they record the essence of his pitch. Your Majesty, the other alchemists are looking in the wrong place. They're trying to create immortality through chemistry, through formulas and potions. But immortality cannot be created. It already exists, and I know where to find it. The room has gone quiet. The emperor leans forward. Xu Fu continues. In the Eastern Sea, there are 3 islands, Penglai, Fangjiang, and Yingzhou. These are the islands of the Immortals. They exist in mist and fog, appearing and disappearing. On these islands live the Xian, beings who have transcended death. They have palaces made of gold and silver. They have trees that bear pearls instead of fruit. And most importantly, they possess the true elixir of life. Not the crude approximations we make here, but the genuine article. Someone in the room might have scoffed. These islands were well known in Chinese mythology, but they were legends, fairy tales. Nobody had ever actually found them. But Xu Fu is ready for this objection. I know the route to these islands. I know where they are. I can reach them. But I will need ships, crew, and provisions for the journey. Now here's what's brilliant about Xu Fu's pitch, and why it worked when so many others had failed. First, he's not promising a miracle tomorrow. He's not saying, drink this potion and you'll live forever. He's saying, give me the resources to make a journey, and I'll bring back what you need. It's concrete. It's believable. Second, he's tying into existing mythology. Everyone in that room has heard of Penglai, Fangjiang, and Yingzhou. These islands are part of the cultural consciousness, so Xu Fu isn't asking them to believe in something new. He's claiming he can find something they already believe exists. Third, and most importantly, he's asking for resources, not just offering promises. Con men who just want money make the emperor feel like he's buying something. But Xu Fu is asking for ships and supplies, things that suggest a real expedition, a real attempt. The first emperor agrees. In 219 BCE, Xu Fu is given ships, crew, and provisions. The historical records don't tell us exactly how many ships or how many people, but it was substantial enough to be noted in the official histories. The fleet sails east into the Yellow Sea toward the unknown, and then Xu Fu returns. But he returns empty-handed. No elixir, no evidence of the islands, no proof of anything. He has an excuse, though, and this excuse is recorded in the historical texts. According to Sima Qian, writing in his records of the Grand Historian about 100 years after these events, Xu Fu told the emperor, "We encountered a great sea creature, a massive fish or dragon that blocked our path to the islands. Every time we tried to approach, it drove us back. We need weapons." We need crossbowmen to kill this creature. Give me these and we will succeed. Now, let's pause here and ask the obvious question. Why did the emperor believe this? A giant sea creature blocking the path to the magical islands. It sounds absurd. And yet, the first emperor, a man who had conquered China through military strategy, who was not generally known for being gullible, believed Xu Fu enough to send him again. Why? Several possibilities. Theory 1. Xu Fu brought back something. Some kind of evidence, some artifact or story that's not recorded in the histories, but that convinced the emperor there was something real out there. Theory 2. The emperor was desperate. By 219 BCE, he's in his early 40s. He can feel time slipping away. He needs to believe that immortality is possible, so he's willing to believe almost anything that offers hope. Theory 3. Xu Fu was that convincing. Some people are natural manipulators, able to sell anything. Maybe Xu Fu was one of these people, charismatic enough, confident enough, detailed enough in his descriptions that he made the impossible seem real. Theory 4. Xu Fu actually did encounter something strange. Perhaps not a magical creature, but something, a whale, a storm, dangerous currents, that gave him a kernel of truth to build his story around. We don't know which of these is correct. Maybe all of them are partially true. What we do know is this. The emperor gave Xu Fu another chance. But this time, Xu Fu asked for much, much more. Between 219 BCE and 210 BCE, something changed. 9 years passed. The first emperor grew older, more desperate. His fear of death intensified. Several of his other Fangshi had failed to deliver on their promises and had been executed. Time was running out. And then Xu Fu came back to court with a new proposal. According to the historical records, this is what he asked for: 3,000 young men and women of good birth and craftsmen of all trades. Let me repeat that. 3,000 people. And not just any people. Young men and women specifically. And craftsmen of every trade. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, farmers, builders. And that's not all. He also asked for seeds of 5 different grains, agricultural tools, weapons, extensive provisions. Stop and think about what this list actually represents. This is not the supply list for a voyage to fetch a bottle of elixir. This is the supply list for establishing a colony. You need young men and women if you're planning to have them marry and produce children, to create the next generation. You need craftsmen of every trade if you're planning to build a self-sufficient society, houses, tools, clothes, everything. You need seeds and agricultural tools if you're planning to settle somewhere and grow food. You need weapons if you're planning to defend your new settlement from whoever lives there already. This is not an expedition. This is a complete civilization in miniature, ready to be transplanted somewhere else. And Xu Fu has somehow convinced the first emperor to give him all of it. Why would the emperor agree to this? 3,000 people is an enormous investment. In ancient China, the population was the source of all wealth and power. People paid taxes, grew food, fought in armies. To give away 3,000 young, healthy people was a massive sacrifice. But the emperor agreed, because by now, 210 BCE, he's dying. The mercury in his elixirs is slowly poisoning him. He can feel his body failing. And Xu Fu's request, audacious as it is, makes a kind of sense. Your Majesty, I can reach the islands now. But the immortals who live there, They are not impressed by empty-handed visitors. If I arrive alone, begging for their elixir, they will turn me away. But if I arrive with a demonstration of civilization, with young people and craftsmen and knowledge to share, they will see us as worthy. They will trade with us. They will give us access to their secrets. It's a con artist's masterpiece of misdirection. The scale of the request actually makes it more believable, not less. Because if you're lying, why would you ask for so much? Wouldn't you keep the lie small, manageable? The audacity of asking for 3,000 people makes it seem like Xu Fu must be serious, must be confident of success, and so the emperor, desperate and dying, agrees. Spring, 210 BCE. The eastern coast of China. 3,000 young people have been selected. Families have been told, or perhaps ordered, to send their sons and daughters. Craftsmen have been recruited or conscripted. Ships have been built or commandeered. Supplies have been loaded. The scale of this undertaking cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, organizing an expedition of this size was a logistical nightmare. The coordination required, the ships, the food, the water, the navigation, was enormous. But somehow it happened. The historical records confirm it. Xu Fu's second expedition departed in 210 BCE, and unlike the first voyage, this time he did not return. The ship sailed east, into the Yellow Sea, toward Japan or Korea or Taiwan or some unknown destination, and they vanished. Not one ship came back, not one sailor, not one of those 3,000 young people ever set foot in China again. Complete silence. In September of 210 BCE, just months after Xu Fu's fleet sailed away, Qin Shi Huang died. He was on a tour of his empire when he fell ill. His ministers tried to keep his death secret. They knew that if word got out that the emperor was dead, rebellions would start immediately. So they transported his body back to the capital in his sealed carriage, with servants pretending he was still alive, burning fish to cover the smell of decay. When they finally announced his death, the empire began to unravel. His son took the throne, but was weak and manipulated by ministers. Within 4 years, the Qin dynasty collapsed. Rebellions erupted. China descended into civil war. The dynasty that the first emperor built to last 10,000 generations lasted 15 years. And the man who had obsessed over immortality, who had built the most elaborate tomb in human history, who had drunk mercury elixirs and sent expeditions across the sea, who had killed scholars and burned books and terrorized millions in his quest to never die. He died at 50, probably poisoned by his own immortality treatments. His body was placed in a tomb complex so vast that it took 700,000 workers 38 years to build. The tomb chamber, still unexcavated today, is said to contain rivers of mercury. The Terracotta Army, 8,000 life-size soldiers, each with a unique face, guards the entrance. It's one of the most magnificent tombs ever constructed, and it's a monument to the futility of trying to conquer death. Meanwhile, somewhere across the sea, Xu Fu and his 3,000 followers were, where? Dead? Alive? Thriving in some new land? Nobody in China knew, and for 100 years, nobody in China particularly cared. The empire had collapsed into civil war. The Qin dynasty was overthrown. New dynasties rose and fell. In all that chaos, one missing fleet was the least of anyone's concerns. But the story didn't die. It was recorded by Sima Qian in his history, written around 100 BCE. And once it was written down, it became permanent. It became a mystery that would haunt Asia for the next 2,000 years. Before we go further, let's be clear about what we can actually prove from contemporary sources. Our primary source is Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, Shiji, written around 100 BCE, roughly 100 years after Xu Fu's voyage. Sima Qian was the court historian for the Han Dynasty, and he's generally considered very reliable. He had access to official Qin Dynasty records that no longer exist. Here's what Sima Qian wrote about Xu Fu's second voyage. Xu Fu obtained a plain and wide marsh and made himself king and did not return. That's it. That's the entire description of what happened. Obtained a plain and wide marsh and made himself king. This is a tantalizing statement. It suggests that Xu Fu didn't die at sea. It suggests he landed somewhere with flat land and marshes. And it suggests he established some kind of rule over territory. But it tells us nothing about where or how or what happened to him and his 3,000 followers. That ambiguity, that gap in the story, is what has driven 2,200 years of speculation. Let me ask you something. In all of human history, how many times has a fleet of ships carrying thousands of people vanished without a trace, and we genuinely don't know what happened to them? The answer is almost never. Usually, we know. Ships sink and survivors wash ashore with tales of the disaster, or colonies settle somewhere and eventually contact is re-established, or expeditions return, successful or not. But Xu Fu's fleet, nothing. Total silence. In ancient China, abandoning an imperial mission was treason of the highest order, not just for the person who fled, but for their entire family, their clan, everyone connected to them. The punishment was death, and often torture before death. The stakes for not returning to China were absolute, so if Xu Fu and his 3,000 people never came back, one of three things happened. 1. They all died. Every ship sank. Every person drowned. No survivors made it to shore, or if they did, they died there before they could establish anything permanent. It was a complete disaster. 2. They landed somewhere, but something prevented them from returning. Disease, hostile locals, shipwrecks on the return journey. Something made return impossible, even if they wanted to. 3. They chose not to return. They landed somewhere, and Xu Fu and his followers decided that whatever they'd found was better than going back to serve a tyrant. They chose freedom, or a new life, or something else. And they kept that choice a secret forever. Which of these is true? That's the mystery we're going to explore. But to solve it, or at least to understand the theories, we need to follow the trail. We need to look at what happened in the lands to the east of China in the years after 210 BCE. We need to see if there's any evidence of 3,000 Chinese settlers arriving somewhere, bringing new technology, new knowledge, new blood. We need to hunt for the ghost fleet. And the place where the trail is strongest, where the traditions are oldest, where the evidence is most compelling, even if it's not conclusive, is Japan. Japan in 210 BCE was a land in transition. The Jomon period, characterized by hunter-gatherer culture and stone tools, was giving way to the Yayoi period, characterized by rice agriculture, metalworking, and more complex society. But the exact timeline of how and when these technologies arrived in Japan is still debated by archaeologists, because the changes didn't happen evenly. In some regions, advanced technologies appeared suddenly, almost as if they'd been imported wholesale, rather than developed gradually. And in multiple locations across Japan, from the southern tip of Kyushu to the northern reaches of Honshu, there are traditions, shrines, and festivals that claim to know exactly how these technologies arrived. They claim a man named Jofuku brought them, a Chinese alchemist who sailed from the court of the first emperor and landed on Japanese shores with thousands of followers. Jofuku, the Japanese pronunciation of Shufu. Are these traditions based on reality, or are they folk legends that grew to explain cultural changes that had other causes? That's what we need to investigate. Because if Shufu really did reach Japan, if he really did settle there with 3,000 people, then somewhere in Japan there should be evidence, archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, historical evidence. And if we're very lucky, maybe even an answer to the question that has haunted Asia for 2,200 years. What happened to the man who sailed away to find immortality? Before we look at the claims and the evidence, let's start with a simple question. If Shufu sailed east from the coast of China in 210 BCE, where would the ocean have taken him? This isn't a mystery. We know how the currents work in the East China Sea. We know how seasonal winds affect navigation, and we know that ancient sailors, while they didn't have compasses or modern navigation tools, were extremely good at reading the ocean, the stars, and the weather. If you sail east from the Shandong Peninsula, where Shufu likely departed, the currents and prevailing winds will push you in one of several directions. Northeast toward Korea. The Korean peninsula is the closest landmass. If you sailed east and slightly north, you'd likely hit Korea first. The distance is manageable, only a few hundred kilometers, and there was already some trade contact between China and Korea during this period. East toward Japan. If you sailed due east and caught the right currents, you'd eventually reach either Kyushu, the southern main island of Japan, or the smaller islands between Korea and Japan. This is a longer journey, roughly 800 to 1,000 kilometers, depending on your starting point, but definitely achievable with the ships of the period. Southeast toward the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa. If you were pushed south by currents or storms, you might end up in the chain of islands between Japan and Taiwan. These islands are more remote, more tropical, and in 210 BCE would have been very sparsely populated. All three of these destinations are possible. And interestingly, all three of them have traditions claiming Shufu landed there. But the traditions are strongest, most detailed, and most persistent in Japan. So let's start there. To understand the Shufu mystery, you need to understand what was happening in Japan when he supposedly arrived. Japanese archaeology divides the ancient period into distinct eras based on the types of pottery and tools found in archaeological sites. The Jomon period, 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, characterized by hunter-gatherer societies, cord-marked pottery, stone tools, and a relatively stable, egalitarian social structure. The Jomon people were skilled artisans and fishermen, but they didn't practice large-scale agriculture and didn't work with metals. The Yayoi period, 300 BCE to 300 CE, characterized by wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron tools, more hierarchical societies, and pottery styles that show clear influence from the Asian mainland. The transition between these two periods represents one of the most significant cultural shifts in Japanese history. It's the shift from Stone Age to Bronze Age/Iron Age, from hunting and gathering to organized agriculture, from egalitarian tribes to stratified societies with chiefs and warriors. And this transition happens right around the time Xu Fu would have arrived. Now, mainstream archaeology explains this transition as the result of gradual migration and cultural exchange from Korea. People from the Korean peninsula gradually moved to Japan over centuries, bringing new technologies with them. They intermarried with the indigenous Jomon people, and slowly the culture shifted. This is probably largely correct. Genetic studies confirm that modern Japanese people are a mix of Jomon ancestry and later migrants from the continent. But here's what's interesting. The changes don't happen evenly across Japan. In some regions, the transition is gradual. You can see pottery styles slowly evolving, technologies slowly appearing. But in other regions, particularly in Kyushu and Western Japan, there are signs of more sudden change. Sites where sophisticated Yayoi-style settlements appear with minimal transition from Jomon culture. Places where metalworking appears very quickly. Regions where rice agriculture spreads faster than migration patterns alone would suggest. It's as if, in some places, the new technologies and cultural practices didn't trickle in gradually. They arrived all at once, almost as if someone had brought them. Now, before you think I'm suggesting Xu Fu single-handedly created the Yayoi period, let me be clear, he didn't. The Yayoi period started around 300 BCE, which is about 90 years before Xu Fu's voyage. So the broader cultural transition was already underway. But what if Xu Fu's fleet arrived in the middle of this transition period? What if 3,000 Chinese settlers, bringing advanced Chinese technology, agricultural knowledge, and organizational skills, landed in Western Japan around 210 BCE? They wouldn't create the Yayoi period, but they might accelerate it. They might explain why certain regions show more sudden advancement. They might leave traces in local traditions, in genetic markers, in cultural practices that seem more Chinese than Korean. And that's exactly what we find. Across Japan, there are multiple locations that claim to be connected to Xu Fu, or as he's known in Japanese, Jofuku Xu Fu. These aren't modern tourist inventions. These are ancient traditions, with shrines that are centuries old, festivals that have been celebrated for generations, and local histories that predate any modern academic interest in the Xu Fu question. Let me take you to these places. Location 1, Xingu, Wakayama Prefecture. Xingu is a small city on the southeastern coast of the Qin Peninsula, about 400 kilometers southwest of Tokyo. It's a beautiful, somewhat remote area, mountains to the west, the Pacific Ocean to the east, rivers running through valleys. In the center of Xingu stands the Jofuku Shrine, Jofuku no Miya. The shrine is ancient. No one knows exactly when it was built, but local records mention its existence going back at least 700 to 800 years. And the tradition it commemorates is claimed to be much, much older. The shrine is dedicated to Xu Fu. According to local tradition, this is where he landed when he arrived from China, and this is where he settled. Next to the shrine is a grave mound, the grave of Jofuku. Local tradition says Xu Fu is buried here. Every year on November 28th, the city holds the Jofuku Festival. I've watched videos of this festival, and it's remarkable. Thousands of people attend. Participants dress in traditional Chinese clothing, styled after the Qin dynasty period. Long robes, ornate hats, the kind of costumes you see in Chinese historical dramas set in the 3rd century BCE. They perform a reenactment of Shu Fu's landing. A procession moves through the city streets, carrying banners, beating drums, acting out the arrival of the Chinese fleet. There are speeches honoring Jofuku as a cultural benefactor who brought knowledge and civilization to Japan. This isn't a small event. This isn't a quirky local tradition that 3 people care about. This is a major cultural festival, deeply embedded in the community's identity. But why? Why would a Japanese city create a centuries-old tradition honoring a Chinese alchemist if there wasn't some historical basis for it? The local explanations are detailed and specific. They don't just say Shu Fu landed here. They say Shu Fu arrived with his followers and recognized the area as similar to the mythical Penglai Island, mountains shrouded in mist, abundant water, beautiful natural scenery. He and his people settled in the Xingu area and taught the local population advanced agricultural techniques, specifically rice cultivation. He introduced Chinese medicinal herbs and healing practices to the region. He lived out his life here peacefully and was buried with honor when he died. Some local families claim descent from Shu Fu's followers. Their family names, they say, are Chinese in origin. Their ancestors, they say, came with Jofuku from across the sea. Now let's be skeptical for a moment, because we should be. First problem, the grave. Has it ever been excavated? Has anyone actually checked if there are human remains inside? And if so, whether they're from the right time period? Answer, no. The grave is considered sacred. Local authorities have refused to allow excavation, so we have no physical proof that anyone is actually buried there, much less Shu Fu specifically. Second problem, when was the shrine actually built? If it's only 700 years old, that means it was built 1,000 years after Shu Fu supposedly landed. That's a long time for a tradition to be maintained purely through oral history. People's memories distort, stories change, myths grow. Answer, we don't know exactly when the shrine was built. The current structure may be relatively recent, but that doesn't mean the tradition itself is recent. Sacred sites often have structures rebuilt multiple times on the same location. The tradition could be older than the physical shrine. Third problem, how do we know this tradition isn't just medieval folklore? Maybe in the 13th or 14th century, someone in Xingu read Sima Qian's history, saw the story about Shu Fu, and decided, hey, that would be a cool origin story for our town, and the tradition grew from there. Answer, this is possible. It's actually one of the more plausible skeptical explanations. Invented traditions are not uncommon in history. Many towns and cities have created origin myths to give themselves prestige or distinctiveness. But here's what gives me pause. Xingu isn't the only place with this tradition. There are multiple locations across Japan, separated by hundreds of kilometers, with similar claims. If these traditions were all invented, they were invented independently in multiple places. That seems less likely than all of them preserving some fragment of actual historical memory. Location 2, Saga Prefecture, Kyushu. About 1,000 kilometers southwest of Xingu, on the island of Kyushu, is another Jofuku shrine. This one is in Saga Prefecture, in a place called Kinryu, which translates to Golden Dragon. The shrine is smaller than the one in Xingu, but the tradition is just as old. According to local legend, this is where Xu Fu first landed in Japan. The story goes, Xu Fu's fleet approached the coast of Kyushu and anchored in a bay. He and his followers came ashore and encountered the local people, Yayoi, period inhabitants who were already practicing some agriculture, but at a relatively basic level. Xu Fu taught them advanced rice cultivation techniques, including how to build irrigation systems and paddies for wet rice farming. He stayed for a period of time, long enough to ensure the knowledge was transferred, and then moved on, sailing further north along the coast. So according to this tradition, Kyushu was a stopping point, not Xu Fu's final destination. He landed here first, shared knowledge, and then continued his journey. Interestingly, there's some archaeological support for the idea that Kyushu was a major entry point for continental culture during the Yayoi period. The earliest Yayoi period sites in Japan are found in northern Kyushu. This makes sense geographically. Kyushu is the closest Japanese island to Korea, and it's the logical first landing point for anyone coming from the Asian mainland. Moreover, studies of Yayoi period rice cultivation show that the techniques used were sophisticated, more sophisticated than what would have developed independently. They show clear influence from Chinese agricultural practices. Does this prove Xu Fu landed here? Number. Because these technologies could have come through trade, gradual migration, or cultural exchange without any need for a single dramatic arrival of 3,000 Chinese settlers. But it doesn't disprove it either. If Xu Fu did land in Kyushu and teach rice cultivation, the archaeological record would look pretty much like what we see. In the 1980s, when Saga Prefecture was developing what is now called Jofuku Park, a public park commemorating the Xu Fu legend, Chinese archaeologists were invited to examine the area. They found pottery shards at the site. Some of these shards were analyzed and dated to approximately the late Warring States to early Han period, which would be roughly the right time frame for Xu Fu's voyage. But, and this is important, pottery dating is not exact, especially for pieces that don't have organic material for carbon dating. The shards could be from 300 BCE or 100 BCE or anywhere in between. They prove that there was human activity in this area during the general period, but they don't prove it was Xu Fu's expedition specifically. Still, it's tantalizing. It's a small piece of potential evidence in a mystery that has very little hard evidence. Location 3. The Mount Fuji region. And now we come to the most audacious claim of all. In the region around Mount Fuji, that iconic snow-capped volcano that dominates the landscape of central Japan, there is yet another Jofuku shrine and yet another tradition. According to this tradition, Xu Fu saw Mount Fuji from the sea, a perfect cone rising above the clouds, mist swirling around its peak. He recognized it as one of the mythical mountains of the Immortals, possibly Penglai itself, or one of the other sacred peaks. He landed and climbed Mount Fuji, searching for the Immortals and the elixir of life. He found no Immortals. Either they had never been there, or they had already left. Realizing his quest had failed, he settled at the base of the mountain and lived out his life there. Now, this story is fascinating for several reasons. First, it directly addresses the central question of Xu Fu's mission. Did he find what he was looking for? According to this tradition, he found the mountains. They were real places, not pure mythology. But he didn't find immortality. The Immortals were gone, or had never existed. His quest failed, but rather than return to China in failure and face certain execution, he chose to stay. He chose to make a new life in this land that was close enough to the mythical paradise he'd sought. Second, Mount Fuji actually fits some of the descriptions of the mythical Penglai. In Chinese texts, Penglai is described as a mountain that seems to float on mist, that appears and disappears, that is beautiful beyond description. Mount Fuji does exactly this. On certain days, especially in autumn and spring, mist and clouds swirl around Fuji's peak in a way that makes it seem to float in the sky. From a distance, when the base is obscured by fog, it looks like a mountain suspended in heaven. If Xu Fu saw Mount Fuji on one of these days, he might genuinely have believed he'd found the dwelling place of the Immortals. Third, Mount Fuji has been considered sacred in Japanese spirituality for thousands of years. It was, and still is, a pilgrimage site, a place of spiritual power. If Xu Fu was looking for a mountain with special properties, a mountain that felt different from ordinary places, Fuji would certainly qualify. But again, let's be skeptical. The problem with this tradition is the same as the others. We have no physical proof. The Jofuku Shrine near Mount Fuji doesn't have a grave. It doesn't have artifacts. It's a memorial to a story, but the story itself can't be verified. And Mount Fuji is so famous, so central to Japanese culture, that any legendary figure might get linked to it eventually. Connecting Xu Fu to Mount Fuji makes for a better story, a more romantic story than connecting him to some random patch of coastline. So this tradition might be historical memory, or it might be later embellishment, added to make the Xu Fu legend more dramatic. We don't know. Here's what strikes me about these multiple locations claiming connection to Xu Fu. They're not contradictory. They don't all claim Xu Fu landed here and only here and stayed forever. Instead, they tell different parts of a possible journey. Kyushu, first landing, various coastal areas, stops along the way, Xingu or the Fuji region, final settlement. If you wanted to invent a legend, you'd expect each town to claim this is the only true Xu Fu site. But instead, the traditions seem to complement each other, as if they're preserving different pieces of an actual journey. That pattern of multiple sites with non-competing claims actually makes the legends seem more credible, not less, because it suggests they might be based on something real, a fleet that did actually move along the Japanese coast, stopping in multiple places before finally settling somewhere. But I can hear the skeptical voice in your head. Okay, so there are traditions and shrines. But traditions can be invented. Shrines can be built based on legends rather than history. Where's the hard evidence? Where's the proof? Fair question. Let's look at the attempts to find that proof. Over the last century, and especially in the last 40 years, archaeologists and historians from both China and Japan have tried to find definitive evidence of Xu Fu's expedition. They've tried several approaches. Approach 1: excavation. The most obvious approach is to excavate sites associated with Xu Fu and look for artifacts. If 3,000 Chinese settlers landed in Japan in 210 BCE, they would have brought things with them. Chinese pottery styles, Chinese tools, Chinese coins, weapons, personal items, something distinctively from the Qin dynasty period. So archaeologists have excavated around several of the shrines, particularly in Xingu and Saga. What have they found? Pottery, stone tools, some metal implements, evidence of human habitation during the Yayoi period, but nothing definitively Chinese, nothing that can be clearly dated to exactly 210 BCE, nothing with a label saying "Made in Qin, China." The problem is, even if Shu Fu's people landed and settled, within one generation they would have started using local materials and local styles. They would have intermarried with locals. Their children would have been half Japanese. Their pottery would have looked Japanese because they'd be learning from Japanese potters, or teaching Japanese potters who would adapt the techniques to local materials. Within 50 years, they'd be archaeologically invisible. You couldn't distinguish between descendants of Shu Fu's expedition and descendants of any other wave of migration from the mainland. So the absence of distinctively Chinese artifacts doesn't prove Shu Fu wasn't there. It just means we can't prove he was. Approach 2. Maritime archaeology. Another approach. Look for the shipwrecks. If Shu Fu's fleet sailed to Japan, those ships went somewhere. Maybe they were pulled up on shore and dismantled for materials. Or maybe some of them sank, caught in storms, damaged on reefs, abandoned in harbors. Underwater archaeologists have searched the waters between China and Japan, looking for wrecks from the right time period. They've found some. Ancient shipwrecks exist in these waters. The East China Sea has been a maritime highway for thousands of years, so there are wrecks from many periods. But identifying a specific wreck as being from 210 BCE is extremely difficult. Wood degrades. Identifying marks are lost. And even if you found a Chinese ship from 210 BCE, how would you prove it was part of Shu Fu's fleet specifically and not just some merchant vessel or fishing boat? So far, no wreck has been definitively linked to Shu Fu. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The ocean is vast, and 2,000 years is a long time. Approach 3. Genetic studies. This is the most modern and potentially most promising approach. If 3,000 Chinese people landed in Japan and had children with the local population, they would have left genetic traces. Specific DNA markers that are more common in Chinese populations than in indigenous Japanese populations. So, in the 1990s and 2000s, genetic studies were conducted on people living in the areas claiming Shu Fu connections, particularly in Xingu and Saga. The results were complicated. Yes, there are Chinese genetic markers in these populations, but there are Chinese genetic markers throughout Japan because there's been migration and trade between China, Korea, and Japan for thousands of years. Separating out genetic influence from Shu Fu's expedition specifically from genetic influence from any other contact is basically impossible. Some studies claim to find slightly higher concentrations of certain markers in the Shu Fu-related areas, but the statistical significance was debated, and other scientists question the methodology. The general consensus from genetic studies is there was definitely genetic mixing between continental Asian populations and Japanese populations during the Yayoi period, but we can't pinpoint any specific migration event, including Shu Fu's, from genetics alone. Approach 4. Historical linguistics. Another approach. Look at language and place names. If Chinese settlers arrived and settled, they might have given Chinese names to places, or influenced the local language with Chinese words. Some researchers have pointed to place names in the Shu Fu shrine areas that sound vaguely Chinese. Others have noted that certain agricultural terms in Old Japanese have similarities to Chinese terms. But again, this proves ongoing contact and cultural exchange, not necessarily Xu Fu's specific expedition. After decades of investigation using every tool available, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, historical analysis, what have we proven? We've proven that there was significant contact between China and Japan during the Yayoi period. We've proven that Chinese cultural influence, including agricultural techniques and metalworking, reached Japan during this time. We've proven that there's a strong oral tradition in multiple Japanese locations claiming connection to Xu Fu. But we haven't proven that Xu Fu actually landed in Japan. We haven't found his grave, his ships, or any artifact that definitively belonged to his expedition. We have a legend, a very old, very persistent legend. But we don't have proof. So does that mean the legend is false? Does that mean Xu Fu never reached Japan? Not necessarily. The absence of proof isn't proof of absence. Many historical events that we know happened have left little to no archaeological trace. What we can say is this: it's plausible. The timeline works. The geography works. The cultural changes in Japan during that period are consistent with what we'd expect if 3,000 Chinese settlers had arrived. The traditions are old and detailed enough that they might preserve historical memory, but it's not proven, and it may never be provable. But Japan isn't the only place claiming Xu Fu. The Korean peninsula, particularly Jeju Island, has its own traditions. Let me tell you about them briefly, because they add another layer to the mystery. Jeju Island is a volcanic island about 100 kilometers south of the Korean peninsula. It's roughly halfway between China and Japan. If you're sailing east from China and the currents or weather push you slightly north, you might hit Jeju before you reach Japan. And Jeju has legends about Chinese settlers arriving in ancient times. According to local tradition, a group of Chinese immigrants arrived during the Qin dynasty period. They brought new farming techniques and knowledge. They intermarried with the local population. Some families on Jeju claim descent from these Chinese ancestors. Now, unlike Japan, Jeju doesn't have large shrines specifically dedicated to Xu Fu. The tradition is less formalized, less tourist-oriented. It exists more in family oral histories and in academic speculation. But here's what's interesting. Genetic studies on Jeju Island have found something unusual. Jeju Islanders have genetic markers that are more similar to Chinese populations than to mainland Korean populations. They're genetically distinct in ways that suggest they had a unique migration history. Does this prove Xu Fu landed on Jeju? Number. China and Korea have been exchanging people through trade, migration, and conquest for thousands of years. The genetic distinctiveness of Jeju could come from any number of historical events, but it does mean that the legend of Chinese settlers arriving on Jeju isn't completely without foundation. Something happened. Some Chinese genetic influence reached Jeju at some point. Whether that was Xu Fu's expedition or some other event, we can't tell. Here's the challenge with all of these traditions. Xu Fu can't have settled in Xingu and Saga and Mount Fuji and Jeju Island. He wasn't in 5 places at once. So either one of these traditions is true and the others are false or embellished. Xu Fu's expedition stopped at multiple places, landed, stayed briefly, moved on, and different locations remember different phases of the journey. All of the traditions are false, invented long after the fact to give these places a connection to a famous legend. Personally, I think option 2 is most plausible if Xu Fu really did reach Japan. A fleet of ships wouldn't necessarily all land in one place and stay there. They might have sailed along the coast, with different ships stopping at different bays, or with the fleet stopping in multiple locations before finally settling somewhere. That would explain why there are multiple sites with traditions. Each one is remembering a piece of the larger journey. But that's just speculation. We don't know. Before we move on, I should mention that not everyone thinks Xu Fu went to Japan or Korea. Some theories suggest completely different destinations. Theory 1. He never left China. Some historians believe Xu Fu sailed down the Chinese coast, maybe to what is now Zhejiang or Fujian province, or even to Taiwan, found some remote area, settled there, and simply never reported back to the emperor. The historical text says he obtained a plain and wide marsh and made himself king. That description, a plain and a marsh, sounds more like coastal China or Taiwan than mountainous Japan. If this is true, then Xu Fu didn't cross the sea to Japan at all. He just sailed far enough down the coast to be out of the emperor's reach and established a small kingdom there. Evidence for this. The description in the historical text fits better. Taiwan was very sparsely populated in 210 BCE and would have been easy for a group of 3,000 to dominate. Evidence against. No Chinese traditions claim Xu Fu landed anywhere in China. You'd expect some regional legend in Fujian or Taiwan if he'd really settled there. Theory 2. He went south to Southeast Asia. A few scholars have suggested that currents or storms could have pushed Xu Fu's fleet south toward the Philippines, Vietnam, or even further into Southeast Asia. This is a very minority theory, and there's almost no supporting evidence for it. But the Pacific is vast, and ancient ships were at the mercy of wind and current. It's not impossible. Theory 3. He died at sea. The simplest explanation. Xu Fu's fleet was caught in a typhoon or a storm. All the ships sank. All 3,000 people drowned. There is no mystery because there was no landing. This would explain why there's no definitive archaeological evidence anywhere, because the expedition never reached land. But it doesn't explain the legends in Japan. Where did those come from, if nothing happened? Did multiple Japanese communities independently invent the same story about a Chinese alchemist landing on their shores? That seems unlikely. So we have possibilities, we have theories, we have legends and traditions and tiny fragments of potential evidence, but we don't have certainty. We don't have the smoking gun that proves where Xu Fu went. And that brings us to the deeper question, the question that matters more than geography. Why did Xu Fu never return to China? Even if his quest failed, even if he couldn't find the elixir of immortality, why not go back and face the emperor's wrath? People have faced death for less, unless he didn't want to return, unless this was never about finding immortality for the emperor, unless this was about something else entirely. To understand that, we need to ask a question that nobody asked for 2,000 years, because they took the story at face value. What if Xu Fu was lying from the beginning? What if the quest for immortality was a cover story, and his real goal was something completely different? What if this wasn't an expedition at all? What if it was an escape? For 2,200 years, people have asked, where did Xu Fu go? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the right question is, who was Xu Fu and what did he actually want? Because when you look closely at his story, not the legend, but the documented facts, things don't quite add up. Let me show you what I mean. Let's review what Xu Fu asked for on his second expedition. 3,000 young men and women of good birth, craftsmen of every trade, blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, weavers, builders, seeds of 5 different grains, agricultural tools, weapons, extensive provisions. Now ask yourself, why would you need all of this to fetch a bottle of elixir? You wouldn't. This isn't the supply list for a voyage to find something and bring it back. This is the supply list for establishing a permanent settlement. This is the supply list for creating a self-sufficient colony that never needs to return. Let's break it down. 3,000 young people. You need young people if you're planning for them to marry and have children. If you're planning for a next generation. If you're planning to stay somewhere permanently. Craftsmen of every trade. You need this if you're planning to build a complete society from scratch. Houses, tools, clothes, pottery, metalwork, everything a civilization needs to function. Seeds and farming tools. You need this if you're planning to grow your own food. If you're not coming back to China for resupply. Weapons. You need this if you're planning to encounter resistance where you're going. If you're planning to defend your settlement. If you're planning to potentially conquer or displace whoever lives there already. This is not an expedition. This is a complete civilization in miniature, ready to be transplanted. And here's what makes it even more suspicious. Zhu Fu asked for all of this after his first voyage failed. Think about that logic. He returns from the first voyage and says, "Sorry, I couldn't get the elixir because there was a giant sea monster." That's a failure. That's the kind of failure that usually gets a court alchemist executed. But instead of being punished, Zhu Fu is rewarded with vastly more resources for a second attempt. Why would the emperor agree to this? Why would anyone believe that giving the failed alchemist more stuff would lead to better results? Unless Zhu Fu is an extraordinarily skilled manipulator. Unless his pitch was so compelling, so detailed, so confident that it overrode normal skepticism. Or unless the emperor was so desperate, so terrified of death, that he was willing to believe anything that offered hope. Probably both. Now let's talk about what life was like in China in 210 BCE. Because this is important for understanding Zhu Fu's possible motivations. Qin Shi Huang had unified China, yes, but unification came at a terrible cost. The wars of unification killed millions. Entire kingdoms were destroyed. Cities were besieged and razed. Populations were displaced. And once the wars ended, the terror continued. Qin Shi Huang ruled through absolute control and absolute fear. Thought control. In 213 BCE, he ordered the burning of books. Any text that criticized the Qin dynasty or presented alternative philosophies was to be destroyed. Scholars who possessed forbidden books were executed. The goal was to erase history before the Qin dynasty, to make it seem like civilization began with him. Execution of intellectuals. In 212 BCE, he buried 460 Confucian scholars alive. Their crime: criticizing his policies and refusing to accept his vision of history. This is documented in multiple historical sources. It happened. Forced labor. Hundreds of thousands of people were conscripted to work on massive projects. The Great Wall, roads, canals, imperial palaces, the emperor's tomb. Many of these workers died from exhaustion, accidents, or disease. The projects were built on bones. Heavy taxation. The cost of these projects and the military was extracted from the population through crushing taxes. Families were ruined. Famine was common. Absolute surveillance. The Qin dynasty pioneered the system of mutual responsibility, Groups of families were made responsible for each other's behavior. If one person in your group committed a crime or failed to meet a quota, everyone in the group was punished. This created a society of informers. No one could be trusted. Brutal punishments, execution, dismemberment, castration, forced labor. Punishments were designed to be maximally cruel and to serve as examples. Questioning the emperor's authority was a death sentence. Failing an imperial mission was a death sentence. This was not a good place to live, especially if you were educated, intelligent, or valued freedom. And Xu Fu was definitely educated and intelligent. He was a court alchemist, which meant he could read and write, a rare skill in ancient China. He knew the classics, even if he pretended not to after the book burnings. He understood politics. He moved in the emperor's inner circle. He saw what happened to people who failed the emperor. He saw other alchemists executed when their elixirs didn't work, and he knew that his immortality elixirs weren't going to work, because immortality is impossible. He was smart enough to know that eventually he would run out of excuses, and the emperor would run out of patience. His options were: option 1, stay in China and eventually fail and die. Option 2, try to flee on his own. But treason was punished by death, not just for the traitor, but for their entire family. Everyone he'd ever known would be tortured and killed if he ran. Option 3, find a way to leave with the emperor's blessing, to take enough resources to survive wherever he ended up, and to never come back. So here's the theory that makes everything make sense. Xu Fu never intended to find the elixir of immortality. That was a lie from the beginning. His real goal was to escape, to take 3,000 people who wanted freedom or adventure or a new life, and sail away to start a new society somewhere beyond the emperor's reach. And the genius of his plan was that he used the emperor's desperation against him. He weaponized the emperor's fear of death. Here's how the plan works. Step 1. Study everything you can about the sea, the islands to the east, navigation, shipbuilding. Talk to sailors, talk to Korean merchants, learn where the habitable islands are. Step 2. Approach the emperor with a plausible story about mythical islands. Not a story he can easily disprove, but one that's just realistic enough to seem possible. Step 3. Go on a test voyage. Scout potential destinations. Find somewhere that could support a settlement. Return to China and report failure, but failure with a plausible excuse that justifies a bigger second expedition. Step 4. For the second expedition, ask for everything you'd need to establish a permanent colony, but frame it in terms of impressing the immortals, earning their favor. Make the emperor think the huge investment increases the chance of success. Step 5. Recruit carefully. 3,000 people is a lot of people. You can't force them all to go. Word would get out. There would be resistance. So you recruit people who want to leave. Young people looking for adventure. Craftsmen who are tired of imperial labor quotas. Families who've lost everything to war or taxes. People who see this as an opportunity, not a punishment. Step 6. Sail away. Land somewhere remote. Settle, build a new society, and never, ever come back. It's a con. But it's a con with a noble purpose, saving 3,000 people from tyranny. This theory is speculation. I want to be clear about that. We can't prove Xu Fu's motivations. We can't read his mind across 2,200 years. But look at the circumstantial evidence. Evidence 1, the supply list. As we've discussed, it's the supply list for a colony, not an expedition. Xu Fu knew exactly what he was asking for. Evidence 2, the historical text. Remember what Sima Qian wrote? Xu Fu obtained a plain and wide marsh and made himself king, and did not return. Made himself king. That's not the language of someone who's planning to come back. That's the language of someone who settled, established authority, and chose to stay. Evidence 3. Not one person from the expedition ever returned to China. Not one ship. Not one sailor who got homesick or disagreed with the plan or wanted to see their family. In 3,000 people, not one defector. That only makes sense if everyone knew from the beginning that this was a one-way trip. If it was understood, accepted, maybe even desired. Evidence 4, the timing. Xu Fu's second expedition left in 210 BCE. The emperor died months later. The Qin dynasty collapsed within 4 years. If Xu Fu had returned in, say, 208 BCE, he would have returned to a China in chaos, with no emperor to report to and no guarantee of safety. Maybe Xu Fu planned it this way. Maybe he knew the emperor was dying and that the dynasty was unstable. Maybe he figured, get out now, before everything collapses. Evidence 5, the complete silence. If the expedition had failed catastrophically, if all the ships had sunk, if they'd been massacred by hostile islanders, if they'd starved, you'd expect at least one survivor to wash up somewhere, to be found by later travelers, to tell the tale. But there's nothing. Complete silence. That's consistent with deliberate choice not to return, not with disaster. So if the escape theory is true, what does that make Xu Fu? On one hand, he deceived the emperor. He took massive resources, 3,000 lives, ships, supplies, all paid for by the Chinese state, under false pretenses. That's fraud on a historical scale. On the other hand, he gave 3,000 people a chance to escape one of the most brutal regimes in history. He saved them from forced labor, thought control, and the constant fear of arbitrary execution. He gave them freedom. Is that heroism? Or is it just self-preservation wrapped in altruism? I think the answer depends on one crucial question we can never answer. Did those 3,000 people go willingly? If Xu Fu recruited volunteers, if he found people who wanted to leave, who saw this as an opportunity for a better life, then he's a hero. He's a savior who gave people a choice they wouldn't otherwise have had. But if some of those 3,000 people were tricked, or coerced, or forced to go, if families had their children taken and were told it was an honor to serve the emperor, then Xu Fu is a kidnapper, a con man who destroyed lives for his own escape. We don't know which it was. The records don't tell us how the 3,000 were selected or whether they went willingly. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that it was probably a mix. Some volunteers who genuinely wanted to go, some who were recruited with promises of adventure or wealth, and probably some who were conscripted, who had no real choice. Ancient China wasn't a society where people had much control over their own lives. When the emperor's officials came and said, "You're going on this voyage," most people wouldn't have been able to refuse. So the ethics of Xu Fu's plan are murky. He may have been a liberator for some and a kidnapper for others. But here's the final twist in Xu Fu's story. The irony that makes this tale almost poetic. Qin Shi Huang spent his life pursuing immortality. He drank mercury elixirs. He sent multiple expeditions to find the islands of the Immortals. He built a tomb complex that took 700,000 workers and 38 years to complete, designed to preserve his body forever. And he died at 50, probably poisoned by his own immortality treatments. His dynasty collapsed within 4 years. His empire was carved up by warlords. His name became synonymous with tyranny. He's remembered, but he's not celebrated. You visit his tomb, that massive underground palace with the Terracotta Army, and you feel awe at the scale, but also horror at the cost. 8,000 clay soldiers standing guard over a man whose quest for immortality killed him. Xu Fu, on the other hand, Xu Fu, who probably never intended to find immortality, who probably used the quest as a cover for escape. Xu Fu achieved a different kind of immortality. 2,200 years later, we're still talking about him. Shrines are built in his honor in 3 different countries. Festivals celebrate his name. Scholars write papers about his mystery. Genetic studies try to trace his descendants. Cities compete for the honor of being his landing site. His story has become legend, and legends, unlike people, never die. If Xu Fu really did land somewhere, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, wherever, and if he really did live out his life in peace, then he got something Qin Shi Huang never got. A peaceful death. A natural end. The freedom to live without fear. And he got to watch his community grow. To see the children born to his settlers. To know that the 3,000 people he brought had a chance at a better life than they would have had in China. That's not physical immortality, but it might be better. It's the immortality of impact, of legacy, of being remembered not as a tyrant, but as a mystery. I want you to imagine one more scene. This is pure speculation, but humor me. It's dawn, 210 BCE. The fleet is ready to sail. Xu Fu stands at the prow of the lead ship, looking back at the Chinese coast. What is he thinking? Is he proud of what he's about to do? Does he feel like a hero, saving 3,000 people from tyranny? Or is he terrified? Is he thinking about the magnitude of the lie he's told, the risk he's taking, the lives he's responsible for? Is he guilty? Does he think about the families left behind, the people who might be punished when the emperor realizes Xu Fu isn't coming back? Or is he excited? Is he thinking about the adventure ahead, the new land they'll find, the freedom they'll have? All of the above, probably. Human beings are complex. We can feel guilt and excitement, fear and pride, all at the same time. But I think there's one thing Xu Fu definitely felt: determination. Because what he was attempting was almost impossible. To deceive an emperor, to organize a fleet, to navigate unknown seas, to land somewhere and establish a viable settlement. The chances of success were tiny, but he did it anyway. Or at least, he tried. And that takes courage. Whether he was a con man or a hero, whether his plan was noble or selfish, it took incredible courage to sail away into the unknown and never come back. One more thing bothers me about this story. One more question that doesn't have a good answer. Did Xu Fu ever think about going back? Let's say the escape theory is true. Let's say he landed in Japan, settled, built a community. His people thrived. Children were born. Years passed. And then, in 206 BCE, the Qin dynasty fell. The emperor who sent him was long dead. The government that would have executed him for treason no longer existed. China was in chaos, but it was also free of Qin Shi Huang's tyranny. Did Xu Fu think about going back then? Did he think about returning to see his homeland one more time? Did he wonder about the family he left behind? Or by that point, had he become so integrated into his new life that China felt like a distant memory? We'll never know. But I like to think that sometimes, in his later years, he stood on a beach looking west toward China and wondered. So Xu Fu sailed away in 210 BCE and vanished from history. His fleet was never seen again. For a century, China assumed he was dead, drowned at sea, or killed by locals, or simply lost. But then, centuries later, the story started. Travelers from China visiting Japan or Korea would return with strange tales of old men who spoke Chinese, of communities that practiced rituals that seemed almost Chinese but not quite, of healers who knew herbs and techniques that matched ancient Chinese medicine. And some of these travelers claimed they'd met Xu Fu himself, or his descendants. Or perhaps, and this is where the story gets strange, the man himself, still alive, still young, still searching for the islands of the Immortals. The legend of Xu Fu didn't die with him. It grew, it evolved, it became something bigger than history. And for some people, Xu Fu is still out there, still alive, having achieved the very thing he promised the emperor, immortality, not through an elixir, but through mystery, through legend, through becoming more than human, becoming story. The year is 300 CE, roughly 500 years after Xu Fu vanished. You're a Chinese merchant. You've sailed to Japan on business. Trade routes between China and Japan have been re-established under the Qin dynasty. You're traveling through a remote village in western Japan, buying goods, making connections, and you meet an old man. He's a healer, respected in the community. People come to him with illnesses, injuries, chronic pain. He treats them with herbs, acupuncture, techniques that look familiar to you. Very familiar. You strike up a conversation. His Japanese is fluent, but when you speak to him in Chinese, he responds. And his Chinese is old. The pronunciations are slightly off, like someone who learned the language centuries ago and hasn't updated with how it's currently spoken. You mention this and he smiles. "I'm older than I look," he says. You laugh, thinking it's a joke, but there's something in his eyes, something that makes you less certain. "Where did you learn Chinese medicine?" you ask. "I brought it here," he says simply. "From China?" "A long time ago, when the first emperor ruled." You stop laughing. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, died 500 years ago. This man is not 500 years old. He looks perhaps 60, maybe 70. You start to ask another question, but the old man has turned away, back to his herbs and his work, and the conversation is clearly over. That night, you lie awake in the inn, thinking. And you remember a story your grandfather told you about an alchemist named Xu Fu who sailed to find immortality and never returned. And you wonder, did this encounter really happen? Probably not exactly like I described it, but stories like this, travelers claiming to have met someone who might have been Xu Fu or his descendants, circulated for centuries after his disappearance. Some of these stories are clearly folklore, but the interesting thing is how specific and consistent they are. The pattern is always similar. A Chinese visitor to Japan or Korea, an old man, or sometimes an entire community with Chinese features and knowledge, claims of ancient origin, often connected to the Qin dynasty. Knowledge of techniques or information that seems too old, too specific to be recent. By the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, Xu Fu's story had become embedded in Chinese cultural consciousness. Poets wrote about him. Xu Fu, who sought the sacred herbs beyond the eastern seas. The alchemist who sailed away and never returned. The man who found the islands and made them his home. Notice something about these poems? They don't say Xu Fu died. They say he never returned. They say he made the islands his home. There's an assumption in the poetry that Xu Fu succeeded in some way, that he found something worth staying for, that he's still out there, somewhere. In Japan, the legend evolved differently. By the Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, Jofuku, Xu Fu, had become a semi-mythological figure in Japanese folklore. Not quite a god, but not quite human either. A cultural hero, a bringer of civilization. Stories about him became more elaborate. He brought not just rice farming, but the secrets of medicine, weaving, and metallurgy. He could speak to spirits and understand the language of animals. He had discovered herbs that could extend life far beyond normal human limits. He appeared and disappeared mysteriously, always staying just out of reach. By this point, the historical person of Xu Fu had merged with myth. The real man, whatever he did, wherever he went, had been replaced by a legend. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, the shrines and traditions we discussed earlier became formalized. The Jofuku shrine in Shingu was built or rebuilt. The tradition may be older than the current structure. Festivals became annual events. The story of Xu Fu's landing became part of local identity. Similar processes happened in other locations. What may have started as oral tradition, our ancestors came from China during the time of the first emperor, became institutionalized through shrines, festivals, and written records. Now here's the key question. Are these medieval shrines evidence of historical memory? Or are they medieval inventions created to give these communities a prestigious origin story? The honest answer is, we don't know. Both interpretations are possible. It was fashionable in medieval Japan to claim connections to Chinese culture. Chinese civilization was prestigious, and association with it gave communities status. So creating or embellishing a Xu Fu connection might have been politically and socially advantageous. But at the same time, completely inventing a tradition from nothing is hard. Usually, invented traditions have some kernel of truth, some reason why this particular story got attached to this particular place. So maybe the shrines are based on genuine historical memory, passed down through centuries, even if the details have been embellished. Or maybe they're medieval inventions with no historical basis. We can't tell. Interest in Xu Fu largely remained a regional phenomenon until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then two things happened. First, modern archaeology emerged as a science. Japanese and Chinese scholars began systematically studying ancient history using scientific methods. The Yayoi period was defined and studied. Genetics became a tool for understanding ancient migrations. And researchers started asking, could the Xu Fu legend actually be historical? Could we find evidence? This sparked renewed interest. Academic papers were written. Expeditions were organized. The mystery became a legitimate historical question, not just folklore. Second, modern nationalism made the Xu Fu question politically significant. For Japan, claiming that Chinese influence brought civilization implied a debt to China, a subordinate relationship. Some Japanese scholars emphasized indigenous development, minimizing or denying Chinese influence. For China, the Xu Fu story became a point of pride. A Chinese explorer who may have reached Japan 1,000 years before conventional accounts of contact. Proof of Chinese maritime capabilities and cultural influence. Both sides politicized the question, which unfortunately made objective research harder. The Xu Fu question stopped being purely historical and became entangled with national pride. But beyond politics and academia, something else happened. Xu Fu became a pop culture figure. In video games, he appears as a character in multiple games, often depicted as an immortal alchemist or a mysterious sage. The game Neo 2 features him prominently. His story is perfect for gaming. Mysterious origins, a quest for immortality, a disappearance that could mean anything. In novels, both Chinese and Japanese authors have written fictional accounts of Xu Fu's journey, imagining what really happened, where he went, what he found. These novels range from historical fiction to fantasy, but all use the historical mystery as their foundation. In anime and manga, Xu Fu appears in several series, usually as an immortal or supernatural character. His quest for the elixir of life makes him a natural fit for stories about alchemy, magic, and forbidden knowledge. In television, Chinese historical dramas have depicted him, though always speculatively since so little is actually known about his life. He's become an archetype, the seeker who found what he was looking for and disappeared, the man who became a mystery. And then there are the true believers, people who don't think Xu Fu is just a historical figure, people who believe he's still alive. This belief exists primarily in New Age and mystical circles, often blended with Taoist spiritual practices or Eastern esotericism. The logic goes something like this. Xu Fu was searching for immortality. He disappeared and was never confirmed dead. There are centuries of reports of someone matching his description. Therefore, perhaps he found what he was looking for. Some modern mystics claim to have encountered Xu Fu in visions or meditations. They say he exists on a higher plane of consciousness, having achieved spiritual, if not physical, immortality through alchemical practice. Others claim he lives in seclusion somewhere, perhaps still in Japan, perhaps on some remote island, perhaps in a hidden valley in China, having discovered the genuine secret of life extension. Now, I don't believe Xu Fu is physically alive today. That would make him 2,200 plus years old, which is biologically impossible given everything we know about human aging. But I understand why the legend persists, because Xu Fu's story has a gap where an ending should be. We don't know how he died. We don't even know if he died. That ambiguity leaves room for imagination, for hope, for the belief that maybe, just maybe, he achieved the impossible. And in a way, he did achieve immortality, just not the kind he promised the emperor. I want to bring you back to the present, to the very real, very physical manifestations of Xu Fu's legend that exist today. Every November 28th in Xingu, Japan, thousands of people gather for the Jofuku festival. I've watched videos of this festival, and it's remarkable. People of all ages participate. There are processions through the streets with people dressed in historical Chinese costumes. There are ceremonies at the shrine. Children perform traditional dances. Local officials give speeches honoring Jofuku's contributions to their community. This isn't a small tourist event. This is a major civic occasion, deeply embedded in the community's identity. Similar festivals, on smaller scales, happen in other locations, claiming Xu Fu connections. Why? Why do these communities maintain these traditions? What do they get out of honoring a possibly mythical Chinese alchemist from 2,200 years ago? I think there are several reasons. Community identity. The Shu Fu legend gives these places a unique identity, a story that sets them apart. They're not just random towns. They're the places where a legendary historical figure landed and settled. Cultural continuity. Maintaining the tradition connects present generations to the past. It says, we remember where we came from. We honor our ancestors. Tourism. Let's be honest, this plays a role. The Shu Fu connection attracts visitors, scholars, and tourists. It has economic value, pride. There's genuine pride in the possibility that their community might have been founded by or influenced by this historical expedition. It's a connection to a grand adventure, to a moment when history pivoted. But I think there's something deeper too. I think these communities maintain the tradition because it represents something universal, the hope that someone can escape a bad situation and find something better, that you can sail into the unknown and discover a new life. Xu Fu's story, whether it's true or not, is a story about transformation, about possibility, about freedom. And that's a story worth celebrating. Let me be honest with you about where we stand on the Shu Fu mystery in 2025. After a century of archaeological investigation, genetic studies, historical analysis, and academic debate, we have learned a lot about ancient China, ancient Japan, and the Yayoi period transition. But we still don't know what happened to Shu Fu. We can't prove he reached Japan. We can't prove he didn't. We can't prove he went to Korea or Taiwan or drowned at sea. We can't prove he was a con man or a hero or something in between. The mystery remains unsolved, and it will probably remain unsolved forever because 2,200 years is simply too long. Too much time for evidence to decay, for stories to distort, for truth and legend to become inseparable. But here's what I find beautiful about that. We live in an age where we can usually find answers. We have satellites that can photograph every inch of the Earth. We have DNA analysis that can trace ancestry back thousands of years. We have historical databases, archaeological techniques, and computing power that would have seemed magical to previous generations. And yet, there are still mysteries. There are still questions we can't answer. There are still gaps in history where we have to admit, we don't know. Shu Fu is one of those gaps. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are more valuable unsolved. Maybe the search is more meaningful than the answer. Because as long as we're searching for Shu Fu, as long as we're wondering what happened to him, his story is alive. He's alive in the questions we ask and the debates we have and the traditions we maintain. That's a kind of immortality he couldn't have predicted. He went searching for an elixir that would let him live forever. Instead, he became a story that will live forever. And stories, unlike people, never die. So what's the truth about Shu Fu? After following him across 2,000 years and 3 countries, after examining the evidence and the theories and the legends, can we say anything definitive? I think we can say a few things. We can say that he was real, a real person who lived in the 3rd century BCE. We can say that he really did lead an expedition of 3,000 people into the Eastern Sea, and that expedition never returned. We can say that something about his story resonated so deeply that it survived for 2,200 years, preserved in multiple cultures, celebrated in festivals, debated by scholars, transformed into legend. But we can't say where he went. We can't say what he found. We can't say how he died, or if he succeeded, or if he had any regrets. We can't solve the mystery, but we can understand why it matters. We can understand what Xu Fu represents and why his story continues to fascinate us. And that's what we'll explore in our conclusion. Not the facts we know, but the meaning we find in the gaps. Let's go back to where we started. Spring, 210 BCE, the eastern coast of China. Dawn. 3,000 young people stand on the beach, their belongings packed, their families weeping, saying goodbye. 60 ships, maybe more, are ready to sail. Supplies for months or years are loaded. Seeds, tools, weapons, everything needed for a new life. And at the prow of the lead ship, Xu Fu. What did he see when he looked at that horizon? When he looked east, toward the unknown? Did he see adventure, freedom, a second chance? Did he see danger? The very real possibility that they'd all die at sea, drowning in a storm, or starving when their provisions ran out? Did he see 3,000 lives he was responsible for? The weight of that responsibility? Or did he see immortality? Not the literal kind, not the magical elixir, but something else. A chance to become something more than a frightened alchemist serving a tyrant. A chance to become a story. We'll never know what Xu Fu thought in that moment. We'll never know his true motivations, his fears, his hopes, but we know what happened next. He sailed away, and he never came back. Let me summarize where the evidence actually stands, stripped of speculation and romance. What we can prove: a man named Xu Fu existed in the late 3rd century BCE. He was a Fangshi, method master alchemist, at the court of Qin Shi Huang. He was given resources for 2 expeditions to find the elixir of immortality. The second expedition, involving 3,000 people and multiple ships, departed in 210 BCE. The expedition never returned to China. The story is recorded in Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, written approximately 100 years after the events. What we have strong evidence for, but can't prove definitively: significant cultural and technological change in Japan during the Yayoi period, 300 BCE to 300 CE. Chinese genetic markers in Japanese and Korean populations, but impossible to attribute to a specific migration event. Very old oral traditions in multiple Japanese locations, claiming connection to Xu Fu shrines and festivals commemorating Xu Fu, some with records going back 700 plus years. What we have legends and theories about but cannot prove: that Xu Fu reached Japan specifically, that he landed at any of the specific locations that claim him, that he and his people survived and established a settlement, that the cultural changes in Japan during this period were caused by or accelerated by his expedition, what his true motivations were, how, when, or where he died. The honest truth is, we don't know what happened to Xu Fu. The mystery remains unsolved after 2,200 years of investigation, but we can make educated guesses. And my educated guess, based on everything we've explored, is this: Xu Fu probably did reach Japan or Korea. The currents, the timing, the traditions, the circumstantial evidence all point that direction more than toward total disaster at sea. He probably did settle somewhere with at least some of his followers, though possibly not all 3,000 survived the journey. He probably did integrate into the local population, bringing Chinese knowledge and technology that accelerated existing cultural transitions. And he probably did live out his life in relative peace, far from the emperor who sent him, watching his community grow. Did he feel guilty? Did he miss China? Did he regret the lie? Did he feel proud of saving 3,000 lives? All of the above, probably. But one thing I think he didn't feel: regret for leaving. Because however things turned out, wherever he ended up, it was better than returning to serve Qin Shi Huang. I want to offer you 3 possible endings to Xu Fu's story. 3 scenarios. One is tragic, one is triumphant, and one is magical. You can choose which one you believe, or you can hold all 3 in your mind as possibilities. Ending 1, the tragedy. Xu Fu's fleet sailed east from China, full of hope and fear and determination. But the East China Sea is dangerous. Typhoons roll through with devastating power. Currents can push ships far off course. Navigation in 210 BCE was primitive. No compasses, no charts, just the stars and dead reckoning. The fleet was caught in a storm. One by one, the ships sank. 3,000 people drowned in the dark water, their dreams of a new life dying with them. Xu Fu's body was never recovered. No one survived to tell the tale. The traditions in Japan and Korea are just that. Traditions, folklore, stories that grew to explain cultural changes that had other causes. There's no historical basis because there was no landing, just tragedy. This is the skeptic's ending, the realistic ending. The ending where human ambition meets the indifference of nature and loses. Ending 2, the triumph. Xu Fu's fleet sailed east and, after weeks at sea, spotted land. They landed on the coast of Japan, perhaps Kyushu, perhaps further north, and found a world utterly different from China. The local people, Yayoi period inhabitants, were initially wary but not hostile. Xu Fu and his followers had brought gifts, seeds, tools, knowledge. They offered to teach rice cultivation, metallurgy, weaving techniques. Gradually, the 2 groups merged. Chinese settlers married local people. Their children were the next generation, half Chinese, half Japanese, belonging fully to their new home. Xu Fu watched his community grow. He lived to see grandchildren born, to see fields of rice growing where there had been only forest, to see his people thriving. He died of old age, peacefully, surrounded by the community he'd created. He was buried with honor, and the memory of his arrival was preserved in oral tradition, eventually becoming the festivals and shrines we see today. This is the optimistic ending, the ending where courage and planning succeed, where the underdog outsmarts the tyrant and finds freedom, where history has a happy ending, at least for some people. Ending 3, the magic. Xu Fu's fleet sailed east and found the islands he was searching for. Not mythical islands exactly, but places that felt mythical. Places where the mist rolled in like breath. Where Mount Fuji seemed to float in the sky. Where ancient forests felt like they held secrets. And in those places, Xu Fu found something. Not an elixir in a bottle, but knowledge. Techniques for meditation, for herbal medicine, for extending life. Not immortality, but longevity. Not magic, but practices that work through discipline and understanding. He learned from the local shamans, the indigenous spiritual practitioners. He shared his Chinese alchemy knowledge. The two systems merged, creating something new, and Xu Fu lived, not forever, but long, longer than anyone should, long enough to become a legend, long enough that people who met him in his youth swore they saw him again decades later, unchanged. He appears throughout history in the accounts of travelers, always at the edges, always mysterious. Is it really him? Or is it his descendants, carrying his name and his knowledge? Or is it the legend itself, so powerful that people see him even when he's not there? This is the romantic ending, the impossible ending, the ending where the quest succeeds, not in the way expected, but in a way that transforms everything. Which ending is true? Probably something close to ending 2, but we'll never know for certain. And maybe that's perfect, because the ambiguity, the mystery, the gap where an ending should be, that's what's kept Xu Fu alive for 2,200 years. Qin Shi Huang and Xu Fu both sought immortality. Both spent years, resources, and energy pursuing it. Qin Shi Huang drank mercury elixirs. He sent multiple expeditions. He built a tomb so elaborate, so massive, that it took 700,000 workers and 38 years to complete. He tried to conquer death through power and wealth and control. He died at 50. His dynasty collapsed. His name became associated with tyranny and brutality. His tomb sits unopened, a monument to fear and megalomania. Xu Fu, on the other hand, Xu Fu, who may have been lying about immortality from the beginning, who may have used the quest as an excuse for escape, achieved something Qin Shi Huang never did. He became immortal, not his body. His body died, probably within normal human lifespan, probably somewhere in Japan or Korea or Taiwan. But his story became immortal. His mystery became immortal. His legend became immortal. 2,200 years later, we're still talking about him. We're still searching for evidence of where he went. We're still debating whether he was a con man or a hero. Cities still celebrate festivals in his honor. Scholars still write papers about him. His name is still known across 3 countries. That's immortality, not of the flesh, but of memory. Not through control, but through mystery. The emperor who tried to control everything, who tried to force immortality through alchemy and architecture, is remembered as a cautionary tale. The alchemist who disappeared, who became a question mark in history, is remembered as an inspiration. I think the reason Xu Fu's story has endured for so long is because it represents something universal, something we all feel at some level. Escape, the desire to leave a bad situation and start over somewhere new, to walk away from tyranny, from oppression, from a life you didn't choose. Freedom, the courage to sail into the unknown, to give up the familiar for the possibility of something better. Transformation, the ability to become someone new, to shed your old identity and create yourself fresh. Mystery, the power of the unexplained, the unsolved, the ambiguous. In a world where everything is documented and tracked and known, Xu Fu remains unknown. Hope. The hope that sometimes, against all odds, the escape plan works. That sometimes you can outsmart the tyrant. That sometimes you can find your paradise. Every time someone feels trapped by circumstances, by society, by expectations, Xu Fu's story whispers, you can leave, you can sail away, you can find something better. Every time someone looks at the horizon and wonders what's out there, Xu Fu's story says, maybe immortality, maybe freedom, maybe answers, maybe just more questions. But it's worth finding out. That's why the story survives. Not because of the historical facts. We barely have any, but because of what it represents. Xu Fu is every person who ever wanted to start over, who ever looked at their life and thought, there has to be something better than this, and then had the courage to go find it. We've spent over an hour chasing Xu Fu across time and space, following him from the Chinese coast to the islands of Japan, examining evidence, evaluating theories, listening to legends. And in the end, we haven't found him. He's still out there, somewhere in history, just beyond our reach. A ghost fleet sailing forever into the mist. A question without an answer. But maybe that's exactly where he should be. Maybe the mystery is the point. Because as long as we're searching for Xu Fu, his story is alive. As long as we're wondering what happened, he's still out there, still sailing, still free. The moment we solve the mystery, the moment we dig up his grave and confirm his identity and write the definitive account of what happened, that's the moment he becomes fixed, dead, historical. Right now, he's neither dead nor alive. He's Schrodinger's alchemist, existing in superposition between history and legend, fact and myth, success and failure. And maybe that's the truest kind of immortality, to be always in motion, always sailing, always just over the horizon. If you've made it this far, thank you for following me on this journey into one of Asia's oldest and strangest mysteries. I want to ask you something. What do you think happened to Xu Fu? Do you think he reached Japan? Do you think he died at sea? Do you think he was a con man, a hero, or something in between? Do you think any of the traditions are based on truth, or are they all folklore? Leave your theories in the comments. Tell me what you believe, because this mystery belongs to all of us now, and every theory, every interpretation, every guess keeps the story alive. And if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, if you believe that some questions are worth asking, even when we can't find the answers, please help us continue this work. Like this video, subscribe to the Midnight Archives. We explore the mysteries of history, not just the dark and terrible ones, but the beautiful ones too. The ones that remind us that the past is full of gaps, and those gaps are where imagination lives. In ancient China, there's a saying, Ju wei tai ping quan, buzuo luan shiren. Better to be a dog in a peaceful time than a person in a chaotic age. Xu Fu lived in a chaotic age. The wars of unification, the terror of Qin Shi Huang's rule, the collapse that came after. But he found a way out, or at least he tried to find a way out. Whether he succeeded, whether those 3,000 people found peace and prosperity, or whether they all drowned in the first storm, we'll never know. But we know he tried, and we know that trying mattered, because 2,200 years later, we still remember the man who sailed away to find immortality. He didn't find it in an elixir, but he found it in story, in mystery, in legend. And that perhaps is enough. May Xu Fu, wherever he landed, wherever he lived, wherever he died, finally rest in peace. And may his mystery continue to inspire us to look beyond the horizon and wonder, what's out there? What could I find if I had the courage to sail away? Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for keeping the mystery alive. Until next time, this has been the Midnight Archives.